Tony, lest there be any mistake, that applause was for you. I think it's only appropriate that we begin this conversation with an expression of condolence, not so much about Brexit, we'll come to that, but I understand Iceland beat the UK in soccer. Do you have a comment?
It's really too tragic. No, I don't know what the American equivalent is, but no, this is bad. This is very bad. I think it's probably, it's the sporting equivalent of Brexit, let's say. Anyway, bonsoir, as we say in Europe.
Well, at least you've given us the lead into something, obviously, that's on people's minds. I was thinking that there have been all kinds of earthquakes that have shaken the populace of the world, and certainly the World Trade Center was one. This is of a different ilk. Why don't you, if you could, give us not only some further understanding of it, but the implications of what this is for both the UK and for the world?
Well, it's the most important decision my country's taken probably since the Second World War. It ends just over 4 decades of membership of the European Union, if it is proceeded with, in the way envisaged at the moment. And it's a decision that is very indicative of the politics that we're dealing with today across the world. And, you know, I say right away that I got this result wrong. I thought we would stay. And it's part of my continuing education about politics today, because I've come to the conclusion I don't really understand it anymore. And, you know, it was a popular revolt against all the things that will be very familiar to you, popular revolt against the establishment, the elites, so on and so forth. It focused really around the issue of immigration. It brought together people who were against Europe for actually different and opposite reasons, strangely. Some people who were against Europe on the right because they believe that Europe's too bureaucratic and too, in a sense, social democratic, and people who are against Europe because they thought Europe meant the free movement of immigrants around the European Union. So it's a very, very big decision, and there's something very odd about it, because we don't yet know what our new relationship with Europe will be. And in the time to come, there will be a negotiation which will have to try and work out what then the British relationship with Europe is, because essentially there are many different aspects to this, but the most important for our economy is that we are part of what's called the European single market, which means there's a free movement of goods and people and services between all the members of the European Union. And the result of that is that you know, our goods and services are sold into the EU. It accounts for roughly 50% of our exports. If we come out of that single market, it stands to reason we will pay a significant economic penalty unless we can renegotiate our way back in. So, yeah, it's a big decision. And, you know, I think the country is slightly in a state of shock. And the other weird thing about it is that, you know, the referendum, you know, as I say to people, it's a bit like it's a bit like an agreement that you're going to swap your house for another house, but you're not allowed to see the other house. So 2 people have seen it and come back, and one says to you it's great, and the other says to you it's terrible. But you've just got to go for it. Now, what happened is that the British people have decided to go for it, but in the next weeks and months, they're going to get the chance to inspect the building, right? And they're going to be able to see, well, here's the deal. If you want back into the single market, then here are the terms. This is what leaving Europe actually means. I mean, those of us who warned that there would be an economic aftershock of the decision to leave were accused of scaremongering. But so far, we've had a fall in the pound more dramatic than any for over 30 years, about $200 to $300 billion wiped off our stock market, and there's the possibility of a credit downgrade for the country. So, as I tried to say to people beforehand, there is a difference between scaremongering and warning. So, this is politics today.
This one crossed the line.
Yeah, but it's politics today everywhere. You see, the interesting thing is, because this is the big choice for Europe now, and it's so tragic in a way that British leadership isn't there in Europe at the moment, because the truth is you could have this referendum in virtually any country in Europe today and risk the same result. So even though the British have actually done it, it's not that those sentiments and feelings of frustration about the elites, the establishment, particularly around the issue of immigration, it's not that those feelings aren't there. They are. I mean, the answer to that, though, is to change the way that Europe works, not to get out.
Tony, you always described yourself, I remember an answer to a question as to how do you keep going? You said, well, I'm an optimist. Is there any optimism about this? Could it be, for instance, you mentioned before that perhaps people and some members of parliament might somehow form together in order to combat this, reverse this? There's words of petitions being signed by millions of people. Is there a hope for that, or do you think the door is closed?
I think it's possible, but right now I can't be sure. And the Leave camp are very, very strong. But I think it's possible that as people see the reality, in other words, they do go and inspect the building, then they start to think maybe it wasn't such a good idea.
Okay. I'm going to ask this question somewhat gingerly, giving you the opportunity to respond to it gingerly. Would you be willing to talk about what this represents and the impact of this on the United States? Do you see any of this happening in this country?
Yeah, I think it happens everywhere, isn't it? I mean, haven't you got a bit of the old Brexit spirit somewhere in there? No, I think this is politics everywhere today, and it's what, the people, for myself who are, I'm from the center-left, but I can work very easily with people on the center-right. And, there are two very odd things that I'm just going to state, although I don't quite know where they take us. One is that there is a desire to shake up the system, even if when you ask what shaking up the system really means, people aren't quite clear. Right? That's the first thing. And so these populist tides, left and right, which say the system's broke and I'm going to fix it. Well, how are you going to fix it? I'm going to fix it. That is, this country's going to be so great. No, that is literally what the Brexit case was, in fact, by the way. But so, you've got that, and then on the other hand, you've got this very curious thing, which is that there is, in fact, a sort of common ground in the center, but the center is absent of solutions at the moment. We're managers of the status quo. Now, that's not a discreditable thing, by the way, but it doesn't reflect the spirit of the times. So we've got to become the change makers again. But you can have change that is sensible and practical, and in today's world, in my view, shouldn't be particularly ideological, or you can have change that is literally about just shaking the system up. But systems can be shaken up and improve, or they can be shaken up and disintegrate.
So you, at one point in something that you wrote, you talk about this in certain ways as a vote on globalization. And from what I know about your attitude towards so much that you do, you believe that, I think you've believed, and properly so, that globalization is a hope for a future in certain ways. So how do you balance these two, the vote against it on the one hand, and yet your perception that this is a driving force for good in the world?
Well, I think the first thing about globalization is that it's a driving force. And it's not created by governments. Sometimes this debate occurs as if governments were taking the decision to push forward with globalization. But there are objective factors that are pushing globalization. Technology, the internet, migration, travel, the way the world's coming together, the way the world communicates. If you look at London, take it as a city, when I first visited in the early 70s, And I look at it now, it's a completely different city. It's a multicultural, multiracial, multi-faith city. It actually makes its living by being open to the world. It feels quite good about globalization, and voted to stay in Europe. But then you go elsewhere and people feel their incomes are flatlining, they're left behind. They get, I think, quite intimidated by the thought of these waves of migration coming into their country. Now, I happen to think that migration brings fresh energy, fresh ideas and creativity to a country. But you've got to accept when you're out there as a practicing politician that there's another side to that people feel threatened and worried. So these are the two competing aspects of globalization. And I think what is important, in my view, is to provide the answers as to how you make globalization work in a just way. In other words, how do you accept globalization as a fact and an opportunity indeed, but how do you prepare people for it? How do you equip people for it? So why I say to people, you're better to, the answer, if you're in one of the seaside towns in the UK and you see the immigrants coming into the country and you don't have a job, the answer is to get educated, the answer is to build the right infrastructure, the answer is to equip you for this new world, not to try and shove it away, because in the end that's not going to work. But the populist who comes along and says, I'll tell you what the answer is, get those immigrants out. That's a powerful rallying cry right across Europe.
So it's been said that in certain ways there was a tremendous break in the demographic way between the youth and those who were not part of the youth in terms of the way they voted. Would that be, in a certain way, a commentary on globalization and technology and a different way of thinking about innovation in the country and for the world?
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. In fact, the interesting thing about this vote is it split us regionally. Scotland and London particularly voting to stay. It split us generationally. Someone sent me a chart where the top of it was years you've got left to live. Right, so, and it's sort of approximately 10 years left, sort of thing. That was the heaviest element for leave, for Brexit, and then you get all the way down to the young people who all want to stay. So generationally, we're absolutely split. And then, as I say, attitudinally, we're split between those who think, look, this is a great new world. I love difference and diversity. And those who say, this world I grew up in, that I was familiar with, doesn't belong to me anymore.
So I'm going to pursue this somewhat tender question that I raised before. Let's say you came here, and I imagine some of the candidates who are running will seek your advice, and you have the sense that the center has to hold, center right, center left has to work together. So what advice would you give to the candidates today?
I think my advice, certainly for the center, is you've got to come out with real solutions to these problems. In other words, you can't simply say to people who are anxious about the way the world's changing that, we've all got to stick together. You've got to have more than just an appeal to those values, although those values are very important. You've got to have answers to some of these questions. And that's why, for example, in my view, there are real questions around economic policy to do with quantitative easing, fiscal policy, and so on. Those are more elevated, if you like, but I think they're very important here and in Europe. But you've got big issues around the reform of government. You've got big issues around what's the role of technology in changing the way that services work? What's the right education reform program? How do you bring opportunity to some of the most deprived and degenerated areas of your country? How do you make sure that those people who feel as if the world's passed them by can be brought back into the system? And you've got to go in a very direct way to the lives that they're leading and make if you believe that the country should be unified behind a sense of purpose that brings people together, then the opportunities have also got to be universal and can't be for an elite at the top.
So one of the things that I know that you've been most focused on, or one of the two things you've been most focused on during these past years, is the issue of governance generally, certainly in particular parts of the world, but seeing governance as significant in the areas of globalization, education, tolerance, and so on. Why?
Yeah, because education is the single biggest liberator today. It's the thing that allows people to make the use of their potential, and in my view, there is no greater social injustice that you can visit upon a person or a community than poor education. And the reason I spent so much of my time in office on education reform was because I was aware that many of the poorest communities had the worst elements of the education system, so we have to reform it. And I think education, infrastructure, inner city regeneration, these things are really important. Basic things also around security and how you handle this issue of immigration. I mean, I'm not somebody, even though I'm pro-immigrant, I think in order to deter prejudice, you have to have rules. There's got to be some order. And a lot of the time, people feel that there are waves of migration that they can't, they're powerless to stop, and that there's no order, no rules around them. So I think all of these things are really important, but I think the first thing we've got to recognize is that the politics that I grew up with have changed in a very fundamental and significant way. And when you get a vote like that happening in the UK, you may disagree with it, you may even feel angry about it, but you've got to come to terms with it.
One of the things that, even when you were in government, you were in a certain way ahead of the wave when it came to talking and thinking about extremism in its various manifestations. You talked about its character and its causes and its, it's the consequences of it. Let's talk now, move a little bit from the innermost concentric circle to, as we enlarge out into the world. Tell us why. I mean, what did you see? What is happening? And what forms is it taking that are the most dangerous for us now?
I mean, I think that this is what I spend a lot of my time studying and thinking about now, partly because of the experiences I went through in government, obviously. I think that the core problem is an ideology, and it's an ideology based on a perversion of the religion of Islam, but it is nonetheless a religious political ideology. I think it began several decades back. I think it was given enormous boost by the Muslim Brotherhood on the one side, the advent of the Iranian theocracy on the other. The storming of Mecca then led to a whole change in the Saudi position.
Most people, I just been reading about the storming of Mecca and the siege of Mecca. In what way, I don't want to interrupt you, but in what way can you explain how that changed the vector of history?
Yeah, that was very, very important, because when the Iranian Revolution began, that posed a direct challenge from Shia Islam, if you like, to Sunni Islam. And the storming of Mecca really grew out of the belief of some of those on the Sunni side that they were being insufficiently fundamentalist in the face of Iran developing this Shia theocracy. And although the storming of Mecca in 1980 was put down very strongly, after it, there was a kind of agreement between the clerical side and the House of Saud as to how things should develop in the future. And in particular, there was an agreement to export some of the ideology, particularly around the sort of Wahhabi thinking in Sunni Islam, to different parts of the world.
A more fundamental way of thinking about Islam.
Yeah, and a quite narrow reading of scripture. So this was also connected with the development of the Muslim Brotherhood, which had begun some decades before. So when you go back in history, you see the development of this political but religious ideology. And then also what happened was that you started to get very young populations in states that often didn't permit a real degree of freedom for their people. And so a lot of the energy got diverted into this type of radical ideology around religion and politics. And, when you look back on it now, you just understand that, for example, 50 years ago, a country like Egypt was 30 million people, now it's 90 million. You know, the populations of these countries have been doubling and often doubling again. The population of Gaza is now with an average age of 19, quarter of the population's under the age of 5. So you've got a whole, this explosion of youth combined with the absence of opportunity, combined with a radical ideology. This is, I think, the reason why you have these problems. And then it became exported to places in Africa, to places in Asia, and we've got the global problem we have today. So I spent a lot of time studying it and working out how to deal with it, because although in my time in office, I was often dealing with the security aspects of this, post 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, 7/7 in London, all of the things we were doing on a global level, I have become convinced that even though security measures are necessary, unless you tackle the underlying ideology, you're not going to succeed in defeating it.
Which is what brings you to the whole issue of education. And so help us understand some of what you perceive needs to be done, because one of the things I think that you take Western governments...
You're a liar, Tony Blair.
All right. All right.
You are responsible for covering up the Saudi financing of 9/11, 3,000 New Yorkers died, and it's your fault covering up the Saudi financing. You know all about this. You're a liar, a mass killer. Showtime reports comes out, you'll go to jail. You serve jail. You're a mass killer.
Well, it's at least a new allegation, that one. I hadn't heard that one before, but anyway. Right, thank you.
Welcome to America.
Actually, I was thinking... I was thinking he was just trying to make me feel at home. But anyway.
Is this what Parliament felt like?
I know Parliament was a bit rougher than that.
So to come back to the question, the issue of education and what you would, you've always talked about the Western governments not addressing the issue head on, and education certainly being one of the issues that you have focused on. What would you say we need to do?
You see, the education element of this is absolutely critical, because now we have a situation in which, as the result of the spread of this ideology, and in particular its attraction into the education systems of countries, you've got a situation today where literally around the world, and my foundation spends a lot of time analyzing this, you will have millions of young people educated to essentially a narrow-minded view of the world, often learning nothing but religion from early in the morning till late at night, the exclusion of science and technology. And we're talking millions of young people here. We're talking, in terms of the education systems of countries, formal and informal, this young population not getting access to the type of critical thinking that is a necessary part of producing tolerant, open-minded people. So this thing about education today, I mean, I sometimes say now, education, in my view, is a security issue. And what I mean by that is that if we carry on allowing these millions of young people to be educated in this way, we shouldn't be surprised if a proportion of them take this ideology to the extreme. So what I'm discussing with people in your Congress here, with governments in Europe is, and indeed in the Middle East, is can we get an education commitment that's similar to the commitment we now have on the environment? In other words, in the environment, over 20 years, and I was involved in the Kyoto Treaty, over 20 years we've eliminated the idea that you pollute within your own boundaries and that's your business. We've constructed a global responsibility to protect the environment. Now, in the same way, in my view, if you are polluting the minds of young people within your borders through your education system, that is a problem not just for you, it's for all of us. So our idea is to have what I call a global commitment on education, where countries undertake to review their education systems, to root out religious prejudice and promote religious tolerance. And this should be the equivalent, if you like, of our commitments to tackle climate change and the problems of the environment.
Which is where the intersection between governance in terms of the stability of central authorities within countries and education, where it intersects and why it's so important.
Yeah, because you see, the other problem is you've often got these governments that don't have the institutional capacity to reform their education systems and educate their children properly. And my point is very simple. If we were spending significant amounts of our dollars and pounds and euros on educating young people in these countries and helping these countries reform their education systems, we would be hugely reducing the necessity at a later time for intervention on security grounds when those countries have become failed states and you've got significant centers of terrorism in them. And right now, I mean, I could take you right across the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa in places like Mali and Chad and Niger and Somalia. And in each one of these places, if we're not careful, you will get failed states with large populations. The population of Niger could be, over the next 30, 40 years, it could rise to 100 million, right? If you don't have a system of institutional capacity to run a country, and in particular to educate your children properly, you're going to have huge problems for the future. So this is, in my view, the critical challenge for Western policy right now. I mean, the security stuff we will have to do. We'll probably have to do it better, and we'll have to do it over a long period of time. But the education part is the dimension that's missing.
You've been somewhat courageous, I think, in talking about Islam in particular and suggesting that it is a misreading of the Quran, a literalness and a misreading of the Quran that's given rise to the religious part of the ideology of extremism. So how does one confront that?
Well, I think, I do study the Quran, but I also study the Torah and the New Testament. And, I'm getting nervous here because I'm with a rabbi. But all religions have the capacity to take their scripture and extract from it things that you can on one interpretation, but you then end up with a very narrow and dogmatic view of that religion. And, Christianity has been through this over centuries. And within Islam, there are varying interpretations. But, what we've got to realize is that this very extreme interpretation doesn't track its way back on a grand scale, really, with, in centuries. It's something that has been, over this last half century or so, has become very prevalent. But there is, and here's the good news, there are plenty of people within Islam prepared to stand up and fight back today. And I'm seeing them in the Middle East, I'm seeing them outside of the Middle East, and those are our allies. Because in the end, the only way the modern world works, because as I say, this era of globalization will push the world further together, the world only works today by respecting each other across the boundaries of faith and culture. It doesn't work in any other way. And therefore, if you have a narrow-minded view of religion that says, you've got to be like me, and if you're not like me, you're my enemy, that doesn't equip you for the modern world. That becomes, in today's world, that is a dangerous sentiment.
So I have a friend in New York, and he may even be here tonight, who has a radio program every week in Egypt, in which he talks about jihad in terms of education, rather than in terms of military killing and intolerance and so on. How do you change the leadership of the Islamic leadership that's going to be the leaders of the next century?
Well, I think the people will emerge, and you are already seeing there are clerics coming together and actually promoting a whole reading of Islam that is entirely in tune with the modern world. And what's happening in the Middle East right now, I think, can best be seen as a struggle of transition where the people of the Middle East are trying to get to these two principles. One is rule-based economies, and the other is religiously tolerant societies. Now, there's a fight going on because basically you had an old order that the West used to like to deal with. The West dealt with the dictators, if you like, in the Middle East for a long period of time because they provided stability. Except what the Arab Spring showed you is that in the end, they didn't. Because ultimately, that population, frustrated by the lack of economic opportunity and angered by the inability to express that frustration politically, rose up and overthrew the old guard. But here's the point, and this is why the Middle East is so difficult today, that two elements came together to overthrow the old guard. One were what I might call the liberal-minded people, who are numerous and badly organized. And then on the other side were the Islamists, who were numerous and well-organized. So what happened was they came together to overthrow the old guard, but then, of course, there was a profound disagreement about what happens next. And that is essentially the struggle that's played out across the Middle East. But if you want any good news, and it's quite hard to see it sometimes when you're out there, I actually think that in today's Middle East, there is actually a majority for rule-based economies and tolerant societies. It's getting there. That's going to be ugly and difficult. And I happen to believe myself that the important thing is for the West to stay engaged with that because it's a project in which we have an acute strategic interest.
So that should move us into the IME, the initiative from the Middle East that you have really been spurring individually and rather forcefully. Tell us why and what is the future. And while we're talking about the Middle East, I don't want to disregard the whole issue of anti-Semitism that in a certain way is rooted in what's going on and how those two are connected in your mind and how one can solve the other. It's a big question, and the rabbi will not weigh in on this for you.
No, when I go back to Israel in the next, week or so.
What number of?
I think I'm now at my 174th visit since leaving office. So, well, my wife always says it's not the number of visits you make, it's the progress that counts, which I didn't think was very supportive, actually, but anyway. But
She's actually a very smart woman.
Yeah, she is a smart woman. Yeah, that's the problem. So, I am, basically, my belief is this, that today there is a common strategic interest between the Israelis and the Arabs. That common interest is, at one level, obvious, which is that they face the same security threats. They face the power of Iran on the one side and every variety of Sunni extremism from Muslim Brotherhood through to ISIS on the other. So this common security threat is obviously a very powerful unifying factor. But there's a second thing, which is that if I'm right in thinking that there are, amongst the people, there is a real desire to evolve towards tolerant societies and rule-based economies, Israel actually is something of a model rather than something that you want to oppose. Now, of course, the legacy of the last 60, 70 years is very difficult to overcome. But precisely because of the turmoil in the Middle East today, the curious thing is there is an openness to the Israelis that I didn't notice even a few years back. And there's so much Israel and the Arab countries could do together. Now, the key that unlocks that door is the Palestinian issue. That's true. And here, again, the region is important because, in my view, you will not get a resolution of the Palestinian issue unless the region is part of the deal, because it's the region that can carry the weight of the peace process.
Do you feel that there is an impetus for that to happen? Do you see it in the region, in the Arab countries? Do you see it in Israel? Do you see it among the Palestinians?
Yes, I think within Israeli politics right now, a regional initiative is probably something that can unify large parts of the political spectrum.
So you can comprehend Israeli politics right now?
Well, look, I've got difficulty comprehending British politics right now. So, but Yeah, I kind of do get Israeli politics, I think, to a degree. I mean, it's pretty brutal at points and internecine, but I think it's a very simple thing, you see. People say to me the Israelis have given up on the two-state solution, and I say to them it's not true, they haven't. What has been cratered is their belief in the credibility of the process to two states. And the truth of the matter is, and it's really a very, very simple proposition, the Israelis will not believe that you can have a Palestinian state without jeopardizing their security, Israeli security, unless they know that that state is going to be properly and securely governed. You know, that's the key for them. Because, you know, I always say to people, I want to understand the Middle East. The first thing is to look at the map. It's a tiny little bit, which is Israel and the Palestinian territories, and this, you know, vast region. And for the Israelis, they need to know that that state will be governed by people who are basically not hostile. Okay, so it's a very simple thing. The reason why the region's so important is that as the disparity between Palestinians and Israelis has grown over the years, Palestinian politics itself is going to have to undergo a large amount of change. And right now, I don't think it has within it the capacity to advance a peace process. And likewise within Israeli politics, until they see that there is a partner on the other side that includes the region, then I think they won't have the confidence to move forward. So I don't think it's that the peace idea is dead. I don't think that's true at all. In fact, I think two states for two peoples is ultimately the only solution that works, because a binational state would be a mistake and very difficult. But I don't think you're going to get to a Palestinian state, to the two-state solution, if you like, just by the conventional thing of you lock them in the room and don't let them out until they come to a solution, because that's not the issue. You could put smart Israelis and smart Palestinians in a room from virtually any corner of society, and they'd probably come up with roughly the same type of solution. You know, the solution's not, it's not a mystery in that sense. The problem is the Israelis have got to believe that that state will be securely and properly governed, and the Palestinians have got to believe that if they do make steps to govern it properly, the Israelis will actually let them run it.
So where are we talking about the other state being a combination of Gaza and the West Bank, and is that feasible? And therefore, what needs to happen, especially in Gaza, for this to happen?
Right, so I think what I've been really proposing is three things that should happen, and we should do this probably starting, frankly, with the Israelis and the Egyptians, because that is the critical relationship in the immediate term. But I think you need three things. You need an agreement for a renewed process within the framework of the Arab Peace Initiative, although Israel will obviously want that to be amended in particular ways because of the passing of time and so on. But that is a basis upon which at least people can come and talk about the core issues. Secondly, you will need a new deal for Gaza, which I think the Israelis are basically willing to agree to, which is to renew the infrastructure of Gaza, to open it up, provided there are proper security guarantees given. And then thirdly, to do measures on the West Bank that give the Palestinians much greater freedom and the ability to develop their economy. Now, I think you need to improve life on the ground before you'll get that political process going effectively.
So it's economics, it's rebuilding, it's a sense, and the growth of a next generation of leadership for the Palestinians.
Yeah, you need your economics, your security, and your politics to go together. But I think those are the three components. Renewed political initiative around the Arab Peace Initiative, elements to improve life on the West Bank, and a major new deal for Gaza. Now, one of the things that also has to happen, and this is again why the region's important, is that we need Palestinian politics ultimately to unify. But it's got to unify on the basis of peace. So this is, again, where the region is important, because in the end, Hamas are going to have to come into a different position if they are to play a part in that process.
So one more part of the region, which we'll talk about, since we're covering the entire world, at least half of the entire world. So the Center for Religion and Geopolitics, which comes out of the Faith Foundation, and publishes these amazing reports. I suggest everybody go online and read some of what's come out of that. talks about how the jihadi movement has become, the terrorist jihadi movement has become global, and how, in fact, if the whole issue with ISIS, if ISIS were to be defeated, it would not be the end of terrorism in this world. So tell us about that, and therefore, how do you combat that?
Well, you do have to defeat ISIS, and you have to defeat it as quickly as you can, because the degree to which they hold territory is the degree to which they can also use that as a recruiting facility. So you do have to defeat ISIS, but you can defeat ISIS, and we will, by the way, but it won't defeat the problem. You will only defeat the problem when you are defeating the conditions in which it grows, and you're defeating the underlying ideology.
So before we take some questions, we're coming to the time where we need to do that. Let me ask you about Tony Blair, the next chapter, which is not necessarily putting you on the spot in terms of government, but how are you dividing your energies now? What are the priorities that you hold, and what does success represent for you?
I think for me, the priorities are working on my basic worldview, if you like, which is how do you make globalization work effectively? And in my view, the big inhibitors are the quality of governance and this extremism question. But then I also, as part of that, the Middle East, in my view, is very important for the whole extremism question. And then finally, I'm also interested in developing some new policy solutions for the center. So it's really all about that. And whether I ever go back into active politics, I don't know really.
Have you thought about the presidency?
Well, that's very kind, but I think there's a birth defect somewhere.
We would sign a petition.
Well, thank you. Thank you. No, I was actually born in Scotland, and right now one of the other things that we're hoping is that the UK stays together, never mind the UK staying in Europe. So this is also a problem.
So let me ask you a few questions. Actually, we're taking them from two different sources. The audience here and live streaming that has asked some questions. So how can there be a two-state solution when one side does not recognize the other side's right to exist?
Well, the answer is there can't. So one precondition, obviously, of any solution is that the right of Israel to exist is recognized. By the way, this is, in my view, really today for the Arab countries, not an issue anymore. I mean, the formal position is that it's only recognition comes only when there's two states. But you only have to go to Israel as often as I do to realize it's not going anywhere. So, but of course, unless there's a genuine acceptance, you see, that's why I say it's not about working out exactly where the border goes. That you can do. It's not really about that. It's about cultural acceptance.
This is an interesting question. How do you address the difference between migrants and refugees?
That is a very good question, because part of this whole European debate mixes the two up and mixes also the anxiety that Europeans often have about refugees, particularly when they're from the conflict zones in the Middle East, is that within the body of refugees there will be people who pose a security threat. So this is the problem. And economic migration should be judged on its merits. I think genuine refugees we should always be open to, because we should have learned from our history in Europe the consequences of not being. But it's important to understand that the worry people have in Europe, which is why I think you need to proceed with a lot of care. It's also why I believe you've got to solve the issue in Syria. But the worry people have is not just with the refugees themselves, the pressure on communities and so on. It is that it's probably true you will have within some of these people coming in, you will have a potential security threat.
And do you have a sense of how you solve the problem in Syria?
Yeah, you've got to. I'm afraid the only way is, it goes back to the West's basic question about the Middle East. Is it prepared to really engage? Is it prepared to commit? Because the thing that has made the difference in the Syria conflict over the last year or so has been Russia's intervention in a way that has changed the balance of negotiating power. And unless we're prepared to commit, we won't have the leverage to get the solution we need. But in the end, there is only one solution for Syria, and it's the same, exactly the same situation in Iraq and in Yemen and Libya. You've got to have a government that is representative of all sections of the population.
You know, I had mentioned it before, but let me be a little bit more pointed about it. This issue of anti-Semitism, and most specifically the issue of BDS, certainly as it pertains to Israel, but as it is being played out in this country, and in the UK too.
Yeah, well, I'm obviously, I strongly oppose the boycott movement. I think it's a grave mistake. And I also, look, one of the things I always say to people about Israel is that it is a vibrant democracy. And whatever criticisms anyone ever levels at the Israeli government, they can't be as fierce as the criticisms that Israelis level at their own government. And, you know, I always say this to people about Israel, that it's, you know, it really is a vibrant. I mean, sometimes occasionally it seems as if it's a little too vibrant as a democracy. But in fact, Israel's the only country I know where if you go and see the prime minister for a sort of formal meeting, I mean, most of my meetings are pretty informal now, but when I was prime minister, you go for a formal meeting with the Israeli prime minister. So the two prime ministers sit like this, and then you've got your aides and advisors down these sides, right? And in the kind of European system, and certainly in most of the other systems in the world, these guys aren't supposed to say anything except nod when you're speaking, right? So nod at the wisdom that is coming forth from the leader.
By the way, that's what happens in synagogues too.
Right. No, I'm sure it doesn't, but it certainly doesn't happen with the Israeli prime minister. I mean, you know, he'll be saying something, one of them will say, no. It's the only country I used to know that would happen. Anyway, it's very amusing to have meetings. But the thing is that look, I mean, I have criticisms of the Israeli government, but unfortunately what happens is that some of the criticisms of Israel, they can trend quickly into anti-Semitism. And, you know, one of the things I find a bit depressing about elements of the Western world is that it's virtually impossible to see a demonstration at the moment in a European capital against what Bashar Assad is doing to his people, which is basically barrel bombing, starving, and beating them into submission. But you could get a demonstration against Israel at the drop of a hat. So there's got to be, you know, some... It's just, and there's another thing I would say to people about the Middle East, which is important, and by the way, I think increasingly is reflected in some of the thinking in the Middle East. And I always say to people, so here's the question. If you were accused of a crime that carried a 20-year jail sentence, and you did not commit that crime, and you were a fierce critic of the government, under which judicial system in the Middle East would you like to be tried? So there's only one answer to that. So it's, you know, for all the problems, you know, this is why the BDS movement is not, it's not sensible.
So here's a question from Kiran on Facebook. Takes us back to the beginning of Brexit. The Labour Party appears to be heading towards an implosion following the referendum result. Do you think Mr. Corbyn should do the sensible thing and resign? And how can the party move forward? You can take the fifth on that.
I think I am going to take the fifth on that, to be honest, because I've avoided answering that question in the UK and shouldn't really answer it here. But all I would say is that I think it is quite important the Labour Party has a leader at the next election that can win an election.
I fully agree. One more, because you also mentioned this. Scotland voted to remain in the EU while the UK voted to leave. Do you support the right of Scotland to stay within the EU?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, one of the anxieties that I have about the vote is that it does put the Scottish issue back on the table again. And there will be a very strong feeling in Scotland that they should be entitled to remain in the EU. This is one of the reasons why I think, and David Cameron said this in the House of Commons today, by the way, that this negotiation about the new relationship with Europe should include representatives from Scotland, because they treasure their relationship with Europe, and we should be respectful of that. And obviously, I don't want to see a situation where Scotland or, heaven forbid, Northern Ireland leave the UK as a result of this vote.
That would undo some of your work.
This would not be good, because one of the real problems, and it's one of the, tell you, the other thing about, the weird thing about this Brexit thing, I don't know whether this is a feature here really, but during the course of the Brexit campaign, the word expert became a term of abuse, right? So if you knew what you were talking about, that really irritated people. And, so one of the things about the consequences of Britain the UK coming out of the European Union is that the Republic of Ireland, on the island, the island of Ireland is obviously divided into two. There's the northern part and Northern Ireland part of the UK, the southern part's the Republic of Ireland. We have a common travel area between the south and the north. But this will be the first time that the UK has been out of Europe and the Republic of Ireland has been in Europe. And that means that the Northern Ireland becomes the hard border with the EU. So this is going to cause enormous stresses and strains, because the nationalist community in the north of Ireland obviously like to keep in touch with the south. So we're going to have to work our way through that as well.
One question from the floor here. Why did Cameron risk political suicide by calling for a vote about Brexit? This one you can't take the fifth on.
Look, I feel in one sense sorry for him, actually, because, after all, it's only a year ago he won a general election with an outright majority. And I think he thought he had to. I don't know that he did. I actually made a speech during the last election campaign as to why we shouldn't have a referendum. But he obviously felt that he had to, and I think he felt he would win.
And a further question, could there be a revote?
Well, I think it's as I'm sitting here now, I think it's very difficult to see. But on the other hand, as I say, the odd thing is in the weeks and months ahead, we're going to see what we're getting instead. And then it's going to be a reality. It's not going to be a claim. And so, the British people are entitled to change their mind, I think. But I don't know. I mean, it's very, very difficult. I think one thing that will be very interesting is whether those people on the Brexit leadership are prepared to show some flexibility around this as well. So we'll have to see, because another very strange thing, and you I think have avoided this here probably, but as things stand at the moment, we could have a general election in Britain before the end of the year, in which you have a right-wing Conservative Party whose leadership wanted Britain out of Europe, and a left-wing Labour Party leadership. And I think that 48% that voted for Remain will feel pretty disenfranchised. So it's a very, it's a fast-moving situation. You can have me back in a few months and I can tell you how it's going.
Well, we were so prescient about the timing of this one. Why don't we just wait and see what happens? I'm going to use this question, Tony, to actually become a little bit more personal in my conversation with you, and which will be about you. But this question comes from Wendy on Facebook. What do you hope your greatest legacy will be?
Well, I think there's a whole set of things and attitudes that I tried to stand for in the country, which is very much about an open and outward-looking and engaged Britain. So this is why Brexit for me was a sadness. And then you've got individual issues like the Northern Ireland peace process, and then of course for me, obviously, foreign policy is going to be a major question. So I think for me the most important thing is if some of the things that we laid down during our time in government, and which, to be fair, I think even this Conservative government has taken forward to a degree, which are around Britain celebrating the fact that it is a tolerant and multicultural society. I mean, this is why I hope this vote doesn't signify that we're going into reverse. I mean, I hope and believe it doesn't really, but it worries me because that is what I regard. I think we came to power with a different type of politics for the 21st century, and I want to see that type of open-minded approach win the day. And the more I go on in politics and the more I travel around the world, I sometimes think that the real distinction today is less between traditional left and traditional right, although I can see that re-gripping parts of our politics. The real distinction is between the closed mind and the open mind, between those who look across the frontiers of race and nation and faith and see opportunity, and those who are scared by it.
Tony, those of us who are fortunate to have known you on something other than a public level could ask this question. I do with the affection that I have for you. What keeps you going? I mean, and well, you've talked about some disappointment in the vote that took place, but what is it? What do you rely on? What gives you strength?
I think the best thing in life is to wake up with a sense of purpose, and the worst thing is to wake up without one. And I remember when I first got involved in politics, and I was a lawyer before then, and I was doing quite well. But when I really decided I wanted to have the crazy idea of sort of changing the world, I felt, I felt a sense of inspiration. And, throughout all my time in politics, despite all the difficulties and challenges, I consider myself very fortunate and very blessed to have led the life that I've led. And secondly, I think, your greatest moments in life are when you feel you're reaching out and touching the lives of others in a positive way. And, I think it's one of the things, we were talking about my legacy earlier, but one of the things I remember doing in 2005 was we had a G8 summit that I made all about Africa and canceling debt for the poorest African countries. And we created a whole new department in our government, and we trebled our aid to Africa. And, there are millions of people today that get the benefit of that on the continent of Africa. And I think, there is something about trying to get out there and change things for the better that does give you a certain energy. So I think it's partly that, and it's partly a fear of failure, probably. I mean, partly it's a sort of, if you're not doing something important, what the hell's the point of living type of thing? You know what I mean?
I do know.
Anyway,
yes.
I'm never quite sure about it, but when I was in Downing Street and the Prime Minister lives above the shop there, okay? So you kind of, because you have a flat above where all the government offices are. And occasionally when the media would be particularly brutal, I would sort of shut the door and I'd go into the kitchen, I'd sit at the kitchen table with Cherie, and I'd start to kind of whinge a bit. Yes. It's also unfair, why they're saying all these horrible things. And she would say, stop moaning. If you don't like it, leave, because it's voluntary. And, I think one of the things I think that in the end does give you a certain excitement is ultimately to be in a position of leadership is an enormous privilege. And, if you're going to do it, you've just got to be prepared to get criticized and shouted at and so on. But you also do get that sense that at least you're trying to do something and do something worthwhile. And, as I say, whenever I give my kids advice, not that they ever take it, but whenever I do, I always say to them, whatever you're going to do, make sure that you're doing it with a real feeling and spirit. Don't just get through the day. That's just existing. If you want to live, you've got to contribute. And that's sort of, I suppose, how I live my life. And I suppose my faith has been very important in that. I am very interested in religion, and I am a person of faith. And I think one of the things that fascinates me as well about the modern world is how do we retrieve spirituality in a world that seems to be so much about science and technology and advancement. And so I also think there's lots of new things that I feel I'd like to know about and feel I'd like to talk about and speak about. So I guess the other thing is if you're infinitely curious about the world, you get a certain energy from that too.
Yeah, and I'd say this is the last question, but it might be a lie, so I'll just, it may be the penultimate question. I know your faith is important to me. You've now mentioned it a couple of times. Can you talk about your faith and how it adds to your life, strengthens you, keeps you going?
Well, it gives you strength because you realize there's something more important than you. But I'm never very good at talking. We don't sort of talk about it in Britain,
It's just a rabbi and a prime minister having a conversation.
But it's not like, in America they got to do God. It's not like that. In the UK, you can't really do that. They sort of cart you off and certify you. But but no, of course, it's axiomatic that if you are someone of faith, it's deeply motivating to you. Not that I'm very good most of the time, but anyway.
Tony,
last one.
the last one is, will you come back?
Well, that's very kind. Thank you. I mean, the honest answer is that I don't know. It's probably unlikely, but why say never? I think, though, it's only worth ever going for anything in politics if you really, really feel motivated to do it. So.
I'm not asking about coming back to politics. I'm talking about coming back to the wild.
Oh, I see. That was two. You see, that's the problem with doing an interview with the rabbi. See, they're too clever, ultimately. Come back to the why, for sure. Coming back to politics. Coming back to politics, maybe, but who knows? But anyway, we'll see. I'll never forget my very first. So I'll finish this. My very first day in Downing Street, because when you win an election in the UK, right, there's no preparing time, right? You fight the election on the Thursday, you win, Friday morning you're in government, you're the Prime Minister, okay? It's a crazy thing. And I always remember going in my very first day, and the tradition is that they line the people up on either side of the corridor going down to the cabinet room at the end of the corridor. And these are all the permanent staff in Downing Street, right? So the tradition is they applaud out the previous guy, and then they applaud in the new person, right? And make them feel welcome, right? So all the staff line up on either side of the corridor, and they're supposed to clap you in. So I come in, and we've been out of power for 18 years. So the staff there, they were all used to the other lot. So when I was going down the line, there were people weeping. I started to get guilty about the whole thing. And but anyway, I go down the corridor, and then there was just these two chairs in the cabinet room, and in that chair was the cabinet secretary, who was a non-political appointment and the head of the civil service in the UK. And I always remember him saying to me in that very sort of clipped British way, he said to me, well done. And then he said, now what? And the whole of my political life is really an attempt to answer that question. And I'm going to keep on answering it, I guess. So.
I know, obviously, I'm speaking on behalf of the entire attendance here and expressing our affection, our gratitude.
Well, minus one or two, maybe.
Well, we've been handing out cards. I'll tell you what, let's make an agreement. I have an idea. We're going to give you a card. I promise you, if you write out your question, I will get it to Mr. Blair and he will answer it. So please do that. I, again, want to express our gratitude for your, I know how trying it was to get here today. I want to express our gratitude and really support you on the work that you're doing. We have a little trifold that everybody will receive on their way out. Tony, I apologize for the interruption, but for now, let us just say thank you, Godspeed, and we'll look forward to it.